Welcome back to Incorporate, the podcast for business owners presented by the UB Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership. This is the show where we dive into the real-world challenges business owners face and strategies that'll help them succeed. I'm your host, Susan Steffen, Executive Director of the UB Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership, hereby known as CEL. And with me for all our podcasts is our producer, Jordan Lima, founder of Lemur Studios, where we're recording today. Today, we're taking on a topic that every entrepreneur needs to understand, legal risk. From hiring your first employee to signing your first contract, there are legal implications at every stage of building a business. And too often, legal mistakes aren't obvious until it's too late. So to help us break it all down, we have two outstanding guests. We have Lisa Coppola, the founder of the Coppola firm and a seasoned attorney working with entrepreneurs and employers, and Matthew Pelkey, an attorney and director of the University at Buffalo's Entrepreneurship Law Center. Lisa, Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I like how in the intro you said, for the legal episode, you said, further known as CEL.
Hereby.
Get that? Yes, hereby, yes.
You go.
I'm trying to go with a theme here.
Wonderful.
All right, can we start off getting to know you and tell us a little bit about your work and the type of business clients you serve? Lisa, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we work with all sorts of businesses at the Coppola firm. Typically, they're small to medium size, but we have several clients in the 7 to 1,000 employee size. And it's all about meeting clients where they're at. What are their needs? How can we best serve and counsel them, coach them along, so to speak?
Gotcha. And Matthew, I know you have a couple of roles, so tell us a little bit about those.
I do. So I'm managing partner at Colligan Law, and we're largely a business services law firm. And then I'm, as you noted, program director at the Entrepreneurship Law Center. A lot of the work that I do is around general business, corporate, and transactional work. And certainly within the e-law center, we are really working with early stage companies. So we're helping them with everything from formation to advising them on intellectual property, certainly some labor and employment issues, securities. We run a pretty broad spectrum of legal issues that we tackle with them.
Gotcha. All right, so we want to dive right into the fun stuff. So tell us from your perspective, what are the most common legal issues that small businesses face, especially when they're early on?
It's not knowing what you don't know. Typically. My background is as a litigator. So I help people, generally speaking, when the wheels come off. And what I have learned and what I've moved into in my practice is counseling those clients so the wheels stay on their vehicle. What don't people know? They don't know how important insurance is. They don't know how to truly assess risk. And many of them don't know how to smoothly reach capitalization, how to get access to capital. Those are just a few in the very beginning stages of a business.
Yeah, I think for us when we're working, especially with a lot of the early stage companies, some common themes that I see, labor employment, hiring your first employee, knowing how to pay them, what to pay them, even if to pay them, right? Common misconception, it's an intern, I don't have to pay them,
Yeah,
right? Certainly intellectual property, documenting the ownership of that IP properly, proper governance, proper planning when it comes to partnerships, right? If you're going into business with someone, just like any marriage, you're going to have a relationship there. And it's important to document how you're going to govern that relationship. And then, similar to what Lisa said, when you're looking to raise capital, especially if you're looking at it from a securities perspective, how to do that properly. Securities is a very complicated area of law. It's very easy to run afoul of those regulations. And if you don't know what you don't know, it's a very common area that we see challenges for young companies.
So Matthew, I want to go back and hit on something you talked about a little bit more, employees, because at least at CEL, we hear that all the time. I don't know how, when, if, what to call them, how do the regulations work? So let's talk about when companies hire employees, both brand new startups as well as existing companies. What are they doing wrong? What do they not know that they don't know? And what would you suggest they do to handle that better?
Yeah, I think one of the threshold issues, and there's a lot to unpack in this area. I mean, we could probably do an entire podcast on just labor and employment issues. But I think one of the threshold issues is this an employee or is it an independent contractor? And just because you want to call someone an independent contractor, just because you have it in a writing in a contract and that's what it says and you both agree to it, doesn't mean that regulators are going to see it that way. And it is a more nuanced test. when you actually look at the law, depending on the jurisdiction you're in. And it can be very easy to run afoul of that. And yeah, there's reasons why businesses want to be an independent contractor, right? It's often cheaper. You don't have to worry about payroll taxes. But if that is truly an employee and you've mischaracterized them as an independent contractor, there's a lot of risk there.
How do you know when somebody's an employee?
Lisa.
Such a great question. Right. And federally, so federal law tells us there's a test to use. It largely is founded on direction and control of the individual, the worker, right? New York has a test as well, right? Where Matthew and I both practice. Some states do, some states don't. It's very important.
Some states even have multiple tests.
Right? Exactly. And we're all trying to figure that out these days, right? So ultimately, it's really important that the business owner get some guidance, get some advice up front
100%.
On how to structure that, right? Because, as Matthew said, if they fall into it's an independent contractor and it's not, the regulators not only will do audits, but they will fine and they will assess interest and penalties on the business. And all of what the business thought was a savings becomes truly an albatross around their neck.
And I'll add to that, once you trigger one investigation through a regulator or audit, it typically has a cascade of investigations or audits from other departments as well. And so now it's 1, 2, 3 letters you're getting from regulators trying to navigate that. And to Lisa's point, the costs well exceed whatever you saved as soon as you have to get lawyers involved.
So when you're going to start hiring employees, or when you're tempted to call somebody an independent contractor, you really need to have somebody review that and say, is this truly an independent contractor?
Without a doubt. And you know what? It doesn't have to necessarily be a lawyer. Everybody should have a good human resources arm, even if it's not in-house. We understand that everybody can have an HR department,
right.
But there are wonderful services with very well-schooled and highly intelligent individuals who can provide that guidance. And if there are nuances or concerns, that's perhaps when you go to legal counsel.
Yeah, to mitigate some of that risk.
Mm-hmm.
I think one other area too where people often, again, this kind of goes to that risk analysis where the risk isn't worth it, processing your own payroll. It sounds like such a silly thing, but for the $50 a week or payroll cycle that you're going to push off to a contractor to do it, it is not worth doing it yourself. 1,000%.
And especially in this day and age where we have lots of remote employees, because that means you've got to be looking at those payrolls, rules, regulations, statutes in the jurisdictions where your employee might be working, right? That became very noticeable during the COVID pandemic, right? And has continued because employees love the opportunity to work remotely. And that might mean somebody hangs out on a beach,
right,
whose, headquarters happens to be way, way up north.
Right.
And the business owner or the management has to understand there are complexities to that.
That really got me thinking. If someone's on the beach and they get hurt,
right,
but they're working,
right,
does that, are they working? So is it like a workman's comp issue?
The jelly.
I will spend. I will
I
spend a few weeks working from a beach to research that. I will fall on that sword.
That's a great question. I started thinking about that in the context of people working from home, right? If you don't set up your home office or your dining room has a bunch of kids' toys on the floor and you trip over the Legos, do you have a comp injury claim? Because
I think there's at least an argument you do.
There absolutely is an argument
for sure.
you do.
I would make that if I was, 100%.
And so that really grays out the area between, right, what an employer has the right to do. Does your employer have the right to tell you need to be a better housekeeper?
Ooh.
Or you better wear pool shoes if you're walking along the sand? It's very interesting nuances.
It's a huge argument for being back in the office. That's always a big discussion. I never thought of that one, but just the employer having control over the space and place is really major.
Right. If you don't shovel your sidewalks and you get hurt going into work, you're in trouble, right? We have our employees. We figured out whether they're 1099s or they're W-2 employees. They're working for us, and it doesn't work out. What do our business owners need to know about terminating an employee?
A whole bunch of things. And the first question to ask yourself is the employee have an employment contract? Because if there's a contract, the contract typically will provide terms. Like we've all heard those phrases, for cause termination, or without cause, also known as for convenience termination. If that's the case, that will guide you. If it's not the case, there are many places, many jurisdictions, including the one we're in right now, that have what's called at-will employment, meaning that someone can be terminated at any time for any reason or no reason at all. The example I always give clients and when I'm doing trainings is, if you wear a purple shirt and I don't like the color purple, I can terminate you because you wore a purple shirt that day. Right? It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think if, one thing I'd add is if you're terminating someone for performance issues, it helps to document that, as much as you can reasonably. And really, this is where you're trying to protect yourself from any claims relating to that termination, right? Discrimination, that it was for some other reason. And listen, sometimes you can't eliminate that possibility, but to the extent that you can make sure that all your ducks in a row before you get to that point, that's helpful. And then there are instances where, depending on the employee, especially if they were a key individual, it may be helpful to have a separation or severance agreement where, you clean up things like intellectual property, or if there were equity incentive rights that you want to clean up, those can be helpful.
But so in the case of the purple shirt person, and they don't obviously like that when you come and fire them and say it's because of the shirt. So, they could try to sue you and claim it's for something else, correct? If it's
sure,
yeah, all the time.
And that's the truism in the law. People sue for sometimes ridiculous reasons and without a basis in the law. And so Matthew's point about documentation is really apt. One of the things that I like to talk about with clients who are new, even some who are really seasoned employers, is you have to have what we would call the difficult conversations with people. It is really important to be assessing a team member's performance, how they're doing, whether they're meeting expectations. And having those conversations can be hard, right? None of us really like to look at people and say, you're not living up to expectations. It can feel uncomfortable, but that's the sort of documentation you want to have so that the purple shirt wearing person doesn't come back and say, no, you terminated me because I'm 62 years old, and it's age discrimination. Right? If you have that documentation, that's what we in the law call a legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for that termination or that separation.
Well, having that documentation would also suggest that there's some sort of key performance indicator, or there's some sort of metric by which you can judge the person, which is good business anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
So, and that takes it from being personal and saying, I don't want you to work here anymore, to saying, look at the sheet, you didn't check these boxes. I'm sorry.
I think that's the best practice, right? If you can, one way to make those difficult conversations easier is if there's clear understanding of what the expectations are, you document that, it's transparent, everybody knows about it, and then you can lay it out in black and white. Did you hit that performance metrics? No. This is how we're measuring the success of the business. You fell short of that, right? You remove the emotion in person. Now, to the extent you can, right? But at least from a management perspective, you remove that, right? It's a much easier task if I can sit down and say, well, you got 3s on all of these and you needed to be at 5s. Like, this is, I'm not losing any sleep over this. It is what it is, right? And you can have that conversation a bit more frankly.
That's a conversation I'd much rather have than something subjective.
I know from a management perspective, removing that subjectivity has made it a lot easier for me.
Well, and that's the upfront work that may seem like you don't have time to do it, but it's going to save you a lot of time in hopefully legal bills later on, is if you have it set up correctly, right? So let's talk a little bit about business structure, because I know we're assuming a lot of our business owners already are incorporated or have an LLC, but how does how they're organized impact like what liability they have to face or rules they have to follow?
Yeah, this is something that we, that we counsel clients on every day with the eLaw Center. The reality is you're going to have limited liability to some degree, effectively with any entity you choose. The more sort of appropriate thought there is, where are there limitations to that liability? One is, you'll have personal liability for unpaid wages and benefits in New York State. And so no matter what entity you choose, if you are an owner of that entity and you have not paid your employees as you were supposed to, you will not have limited liability. That will not protect you. There are also some examples around taxes. I always tell clients, right, 2 things you don't play around with: paying your employees, paying your sales tax. I was like,
sure.
you got to let everything else go. We can mostly clean it up in bankruptcy. Those are the 2 things, that are a real challenge. And then where you've got personal guarantees, right? When we're talking about capitalization, we're talking about financing. You might have an LLC, you might have a C Corp, you might have an S Corp, whatever. Oftentimes, most lenders are going to require personal guarantees. A lot of landlords are going to require personal guarantees. I think the last sort of exception to that is if you are not respecting the corporate form, right? There's something called piercing the corporate veil. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But if you are not treating the business as a separate business, if you are not having proper governance, which we're a big proponent of, courts can disregard that corporate form and hold you personally liable. So really any entity you choose, for the most part, assuming it's an actual entity, right? LLCs, C Corps, S Corps, B Corps, LLPs, you're not just a sole proprietor or general partners, but you're going to have some degree of limited liability and protection. But it is those exceptions, those practices that often catch people by surprise.
So even though you're going to have limited liability, that doesn't mean you can not be a responsible business owner, right? Because
Correct.
They're going to, for everything that you do, there's going to be some personal responsibility, whether you sign a guarantee or whether you acted negligently, I would assume.
Absolutely. And I wanted to emphasize something that Matthew said about personal guarantees, because not every business owner fully understands what that means. And it's a really important part of what I call growing up, right? And as Matthew said, whether it's a lender or a landlord or some other business deal where the other side has much considerably larger bargaining power, if they ask you for a personal guarantee, that means you're saying, I pledge what I own, that if my business can't fulfill its obligation, I'm next in line. And so that could implicate people's homes and their vehicles and the boat and the cottage from which they hunt out in the country, right? Mm-hmm. And that's something individuals really have to take to heart, whether that deal is the right one for them or not, because they're putting a lot of themselves on the line when they sign what's called a PG, or personal guarantee.
Yeah.
I was once advised by a very talented lawyer to not sign as a business owner, but to sign as the manager of the company, because there would still be the implication that I was signing as the owner of the business versus as a manager of the business. And I know we're not giving legal advice here today, but is that something that you would advise never to sign off as the owner in a contract?
I mean, I think it depends on the context, right? If you're signing a documentation for, a commercial loan or, a sophisticated commercial transaction, frankly, the party on the other side is not going to let you do that, right? If you're signing a personal guarantee, that's not going to be,
right.
You signing as a company. You'll be signing as you, the individual. Right. Now, if there's a commercial contract that you're signing and you are signing on behalf of the entity, then yeah, you should be signing as the manager of the LLC or as an officer of the company or the corporation. You should not be signing in your capacity as a shareholder or a member, depending on if it's member, manager, managed, but let's not go down the rabbit hole. And so there is some truth to that. But I think that's more of a disconnect and sort of inartful lawyering, or I'll say, suboptimal lawyering, that you'd be in a situation where the person on the other side would permit that to happen in the wrong circumstance.
Okay.
Right.
A good lawyer on the other side is never going to let you do that.
So they would say no.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. And you want to protect yourself. If the contract is between your business and someone else, you want your business on the line, not you personally.
And that is a mistake that we sometimes see with some companies, is that they get a contract, maybe they don't call us in advance, they sign their name on it, and lo and behold, the contract's with them personally, not the business. This kind of goes to your point, right?
Right.
Don't do that. The whole point of the entity is to give you some limited liability. Guess what? If you don't sign on behalf of the business, you sign in your personal capacity, you are now personally on the hook. Congratulations.
Right.
I wish that these things didn't make me so scared inside. I wish that, I could.
It's a natural feeling. It's okay.
That's right. Yeah. Deep belly breath.
Yes. Yeah. We've made it this far, but that doesn't mean, so all this stuff sounds so scary, but doesn't happen all the time. But Same thing with a car crash or wearing a helmet or any of these things on a bike. You just have to be protected, because when you don't expect it is when it does happen. And that's when you can get in a lot of trouble.
Right. And you need to be ready to react quickly when that trouble comes, rather than trying to, I wish I had a lawyer. So what are the kinds of things that a new business owner, or maybe a business owner who's not new but hasn't ever paid attention to this, should have in writing? What kind of contract should they have in place to avoid disputes down the line?
Absolutely everything. No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, listen, our role, at least as, certainly my philosophy on it is, I am here to educate a client and advise them of the risks. They are the ones that make the business decisions. I tend to operate, and at least it sounds like you do the same. I act in a bit more of an advisory capacity for a lot of my clients. So usually if there's something going on, I know about it. They'll call me. We'll have a conversation about it. They may decide, I don't need you to review this, but we're going to at least have a conversation about what the risks are, right? Does the intellectual property need to be clearly defined here? Or is it okay? Maybe that ambiguity actually weighs in our favor. But typically at least that conversation is going to happen on the front end. I don't know that I can say like blanket, here's when you should and you shouldn't. But I think if you have a lawyer that you trust, that you're working with, that you have a good relationship with, at least have that conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the things that's really important, if business owners, clients, managers can get their arms around, contracts have very typical provisions. Yeah. Many, many contracts have, I always call it the dirty dozen, right? The things on the backside that you wouldn't necessarily even pay attention to, but they have meaning. And if you get yourself a little basic education in that, you'll know the next time somebody hands you a contract to look for it and to decide whether you care or not about it. Because a lot of those things you don't have to care about, but maybe one or two you do. That's where you put your attention when you're negotiating things.
So let's talk for 1 second about how people in a business work together. So we see a lot of, whether it's partnerships or family businesses or, a bunch of friends got a good idea and started together and they've been operating. What do they need to have to look 5, 10, 20, 100 years down the line to kind of protect themselves?
Yeah, I mean, a conversation I always have with those clients on the front end is, right, in a lot of ways I compare starting a business with someone to a marriage. Like right now, it's the honeymoon phase, right? Everyone's excited, they're enthusiastic, they're motivated. Right now is when we need to have the conversation about what happens if someone either wants to leave or needs to leave. And how do we govern that? What happens if someone dies or is disabled or frankly just changes their mind, doesn't want to be here, or isn't a good fit? And that I think is probably the more common area, is that fit issue, right? Do you have the same vision? Do you have the same goals? Are you working towards the actual same end result? And that's a conversation that for whatever reason, a lot of clients who are starting business together don't actually have that conversation. Right. And listen, if the company fails and doesn't make any money, it's not a problem. But if the company is succeeding, well, now it is a problem. Now it's worth fighting about. And now you're going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, to fight about breaking that up. And if you don't have an orderly way to govern that, it's chaotic. It destroys the value in the business. It's a distraction at best. And so I think, putting together, proper governance documents, buy-sell agreements, shareholders agreements, whatever you want to, sort of structure that as, is important. There's a lot of examples of sort of business divorces where, it's incredibly detrimental to the business. And had they sort of engaged in those things at the start, certainly around the vision, the goals, what are you working towards? Are we working to selling this company in 5 years? Or are we going to work this for the rest of our lives and hand it down to our kids? Are you aligned? Are you not? Can you get alignment?
Well, and we see a lot of business owners where maybe they started out aligned, but then life happened.
Sure.
And somebody got married, somebody got divorced, the health condition changed, and all of a sudden they're not aligned.
Right.
And they don't have an agreement in place, and now the business is in jeopardy.
And unfortunately, the longer that continues, right, you stop communicating, then you start losing trust. And now you're not communicating, you don't trust the other person, you're not giving them the benefit of the doubt, you're thinking poor intentions into everything they do. And then it starts getting adversarial, right? And now no one's talking, and now we're only talking through lawyers. Right? And so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, and that's where it really helps my clients that I come at this from the perspective of a litigator, because I can tell them with, honesty and transparency what can happen if that alignment gets, out of whack, and how it is so much easier, as much as it feels like minutia. And, we were college roommates and we stood up for each other's weddings and we're buddies. How much easier it is to just address all those things up front in your operating agreement, your shareholder agreement, whatever it might be. And that's what you can fall back on later.
Yeah.
Susan, you probably, I don't want to put you on the spot, but have a stat on what percentage of businesses fail?
Quite a bit.
Okay.
It's high. It's very high.
Yeah.
It's less high with businesses that have gone through CEL, but I didn't know if you had an exact number, but people aren't making this plan, and is it a majority of
Yes.
businesses?
It's like 75%.
Yeah.
So really,
I think over 10 years, 10-year rate is over 90. It's
10-year
crazy.
rate's over 90.
Yeah.
It's high.
So
no, this goes back to, if you were going to strictly listen to the best legal advice we could give you to limit your risk in a business, it would be don't start a business. Okay.
Not what we're here to do today.
No, but this is where that balance is, right? Of mitigate the risk the best you can, work with counsel so you know where those risks are and understand it. Right. But you can't let us completely drive it because you'd never make a decision.
Right.
For sure. But you know what? Even though the majority fail, there is such a healthy percentage that succeed and flourish, and they do it because of planning.
Right.
They do it because of intentionality. Sure. Sometimes it's just dumb luck. I get that part too. Yeah. But it makes it such a smoother ride to be thinking about these things.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Does it guarantee success? No. But you're going to at least take a lot of common mistakes off the table that will guarantee you don't succeed.
Right.
Right.
Well, we talk to business owners a lot about finding time to work on the business instead of just in the business. And in my opinion, that's what makes the difference between a company that succeeds and it doesn't. And one of the things you need to do to work on the business is think of these risks and the contingencies. And, when somebody trips and falls in your parking lot is not the time to say, I wonder if I should have had a lawyer. You should have that relationship. Just like we tell people, when you desperately need a loan for cash flow, that's not the time to think, maybe I should be talking to a banker. You should already have those relationships established. So what does that look like if somebody comes to a firm and says, I don't have any trouble and I don't know what I need? How do they engage with you to start?
It's really very much a conversation. And a lot of times what I do is work with them around who do they trust and rely on? Do they have a trusted banker, as you said? Mm-hmm. Do they work with somebody who's sophisticated in commercial or business insurance, right? It would be really easy to choose advisors who they know because, of casual relationships. And while that's not always wrong, it's also not always right. So a big part of my initial conversations honestly don't have a lot to do with the law, but have to do with who are the experts around you: banking, insurance, accounting, financial advisor. You want to have that complement of individuals, your so-called kitchen cabinet, who you can fall back on and ask questions to. And in a community like ours, in many communities, we know each other, we care about each other, and we want the community to thrive. And so we all do this together, right? There are many, many selfless professionals who are there to help business owners and new businesses become successful.
Well, and the lawyers should really be a part of that team, right? And they should feel comfortable talking to each other on your behalf as well as with you.
No, and I encourage clients to do that, right? And listen, they're 1 in 50, there's a client that abuses that, right? But for the most part, I tell a client, pick up the phone and call me. Grab lunch, grab dinner, we'll have a conversation, right? Think of me more as an advisor than transactional. Right. Because if you're keeping me in the dark 99% of the time and I have no idea what's going on in the business, I have no idea what your goals are, I have no idea what your personal circumstances are, I'm going to have to get up to speed on all those things before I can give you advice that adds value. So again, build out that team. Think of your lawyer as an advisor. I think finding the right fit, someone you trust, someone that you can work with, someone that is competent experience in the subject matters that are relevant to you. If you are starting a small business, not to disparage, but don't go get your cousin who is a residential real estate attorney, right? That's not going to be someone who's going to be well suited to give you advice that adds value. And really think about those lawyers as advisors. Help them identify accountants, right? Do you have a good accountant? get one.
Right. It's the exact
what are your
same
goals
thing
for the
in all
business?
those disciplines, right? While you may have, just great homeowners insurance through a small residential agent, might not be the best agent to work with for your business, depending what kind of business you have. Do you need a simple commercial general liability policy, or do you need a products liability policy? Do you need bonding? Are you a contractor, right? These are all areas where attorneys can help make these introductions because we have robust networks of professionals we've worked with, we trust, right? We're never going to suggest somebody who we don't have confidence in.
Right. So let's turn the corner a little bit. And since we have experts who've a lot of lived experience in the room, I want to talk a little bit about, I won't call them horror stories, but maybe they are. But give me some of the cautionary tales you've seen for business owners of things that either, planning could have prevented, or maybe some, legal things, bad news happened to them, and because they were in a good spot, it didn't have the impact. Like, share some stories that maybe people could relate to.
Yeah, I'll share one. I'll change the facts and obviously no names here. But these were two individuals who, grew up on the same block, were best friends since they were in grade school, right? Started a business together. Business became fairly successful, almost overnight. And there was never many, if any, conversations around planning. It was just cash was coming in and we were enjoying life, right? And at some point, there was a divergence in the vision of where that business was going. And listen, they tried everything. They brought in consultants. They went through various different programs to try and get on the same page. And, after probably 3-4 years of spending God knows how much on consultants, it became apparent that we were in business divorce territory. These were two individuals who grew up best friends. Went through that process, mediation, ended up going to court. I will say eventually we found a way to separate the two of them. But to this day, they don't talk. Their relationship was completely destroyed. Again, we talked about somebody standing up in somebody's wedding, and this is not a unique story.
Right.
Okay. I could tell you this story in 3 or 4 different iterations of it. I'm not saying don't go into business with your friend or someone you have a good relationship with, but understand what the risks are. And if you can provide for an orderly and somewhat non-adversarial departure when that time comes, it makes a big difference. Yeah. Okay, maybe we're not warm and fuzzy, but at least we all understand what the process is, and we can go our separate ways before this gets incredibly contentious, which inevitably happens if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I would talk about the kinds of incidents or situations that befall businesses that they simply haven't thought about, right? And your example a few minutes ago, Sue, of what if somebody falls in your parking lot, right? Have you thought about, do you have insurance coverage, right? Or in the employment context, there's a beautiful product. You'd think I sell insurance. I don't. There's a beautiful product called Employment Practices Liability Insurance. And for whatever reason, many insurance agents don't talk to their clients about it. But if a company is sued by an employee, they claim discrimination, they claim they were fired because they were old or some other protected status, that coverage, EPL, comes in and provides a lawyer and provides settlement dollars if the matter gets resolved in that fashion. The same as if somebody falls in a parking lot, or you're a food manufacturer and somebody ingests something and claims they've gotten ill and sues because of some defect in that product, right? So remembering to dot I's and cross T's on things that, again, it's preventative. Nobody loves paying insurance premiums, right? We all know that because of our health care and the health insurance premiums we pay. But to have that measure of protection in the event of that incident, that accident, that unforeseen development really can save a business, because having to cover those costs, and it's truly the cost of defending the business, the costs of lawyers like Matthew and me, can get very, very weighty on a business.
So it seems like most everything we've been talking about are the mitigation of risk, right? So understanding your unique business, there's some risks that every business faces, whether it's employee termination or whatever. But then there's businesses, obviously, if you're in food, you have the poisoning risk or whatever. So figuring out the risks that you're facing and then what are the ways to mitigate them, either through your policies, procedures, or through insurance or whatever it is. So is that like, if you're a company and this is the first you're thinking of that, how do you get started on that process? Like to identify what your risks are and mitigate it. Is that a conversation with an attorney? Is that a strategic offsite with your team? Like how would you even start that ball rolling?
I think it's all the above.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. It can be a conversation with an attorney. It can be a conversation with a business advisor. It can also be an affinity group, right? If you're starting a construction company, join a contractors association.
Right.
Trade associations are very helpful.
Fabulous, right? And
even within the legal practice, like as a business owner, right?
100%.
I'm part of a legal trade association. I go to a conference twice a year. One of the most rewarding things out of that is I learn here are up and coming areas and risks and things to think about as the owner of a law firm, right?
So talking to other people who do what you do and then learning from them, which is always a smart idea.
Absolutely. And those industry groups span all sorts of different professions. And right, if you're in retail, if you're an accountant or an architect, right, there are all those kinds of organizations. What's beautiful too about them is many of them are national and international, so you get a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah. And one of the risks that I assume should come up for every business owner would be their succession planning, which we've kind of touched on that before. But part of the legal process should be figuring out what happens. You know, we always use the proverbial if you get hit by a bus, crossing the street to your business. But part of dealing with the what ifs would include whatever that original agreement, right, that you had them sign, whether it's a operating agreement. But then they'd have to have in play what's going on with their families as well, right? Because I'm not an expert because that's why I called you guys in here, but the courts would be looking at what the will for the individual is, what the agreements for the business are, and then trying to figure out what happens in those scenarios. Yes?
I mean, the short answer is it depends, which I hate giving that answer as a lawyer, but it is, right? And this is where determining the goals in the front end is important, right? Okay. Is this a lifestyle business? Is this a closely held business? Are you trying to start a high growth venture backed business where you plan to exit in 5 to 7 years, right? Because those are two very different paths. Mm-hmm. And the documentation options you're going to have in each of those paths are going to be a little bit different. Mm-hmm. So let's sort of push aside the high growth venture because you are either working, once you start taking money from investors, you're working towards an exit one way or another. Either the company's exiting or you're exiting the company, right? When we're in sort of the small business, closely held business, family business space, I mean, succession planning is huge. And the disruption of that can, if you don't go through planning, can be monumental, right? If you even don't have a will, right? Well, now you're into probate. Now you've got to go get letters and testamentary. Depending on what county you're in, that could take a while. At a minimum, it's going to cost you time and money. And during that period of time, you may have a business that nobody has access to the bank's records, documentation, accounts. Right. And so now it's like, well, who's paying the bills? Who even are the bills? So you have that whole mess that can arise. And so, absolutely looking at succession planning. But how does that work? What makes the most sense? It's going to be highly dependent upon the business, right? You have everything from do you have, an individual within the company where this makes sense? Is it a family member? Is it a kid? Does it make sense to look at something like an ESOP, right? Where you're basically selling the company to the employees or to management. Employee stock option plan.
He was going to ask.
I should have. You caught me on that one. Yes.
I said an acronym. I caught myself. These are all things to consider, and there's not a right or wrong answer. It's what makes sense and what aligns with that founder's goals. Or is it as simple as you have multiple founders and there's a buy-sell agreement and there's a life insurance policy. When the individual passes, the life insurance policy is used to pay out that equity, right? That's a very common solution. But it's really going to depend on what the individual facts and circumstances are with that business.
I think it's interesting that a lot of the answers, which of course is what we expect, having lawyers in the room is it depends. And
that is the go-to.
And that's the kind of the go-to
lawyers.
answer. But it does highlight why you need to have a very personal conversation about these, because just because it worked for your neighbor or your buddy in the association, you may get some ideas and some things, but it might not fit your particular circumstance because people don't know, what else you have going on in your life or your business or whatever it is. And that's why you need some good counsel like you guys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We always want to meet people where they are, right? So that they have a good understanding, so that they can act from a place of confidence, right?
Yeah.
And feeling educated and feeling in their power.
Well, we're almost out of time. So I want to leave with one last question for you guys. What is one legal tip you wish that every business owner knew from day one?
Ooh.
Matthew,
I'll go
got
first.
anything?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and we touched on it, but I think it's an important one. Don't think of your attorney as transactional. Think of them as an advisor, part of your team, and develop that relationship. It's tough to give you one tip,
right.
Labor, employment, IP, et cetera. Maybe pay your interns, right? There's my favorite one. Pay your interns. But really think of that relationship as an advisor. Find someone you trust and that you can work with. Because I think everything else kind of flows from there.
Right.
Well, that's brilliant. Mine is very simple. Buy a safe. Know where your documents are and put them someplace where they're not going to be lost. Very, very simple.
That's a great one. Okay. We're getting some safe business going too. I like that.
I had my documents in the stuff before the move. Yeah.
We caught Jordan.
Yeah,
He doesn't know where his documents are.
They're around them. I wouldn't throw those away. They must be around. Well, this has been great for me here. I wasn't taking notes because we're recording this, but
it's okay. We'll send you the invoice.
I'm going to listen to it multiple times over again. There are great places like the UB CEO program where you can learn a little bit about what you don't know, because you can get a class that has an overview, a chalk talk about some of these things that help you spot the things that maybe are missing in your blind spots.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do, unfortunately, make all of our participants in the program think about what happens if they get hit by the bus. So we're right on board with the risk mitigation parts.
Indeed.
Okay, well, from hiring and firing to contracts and compliance, today's conversation has made one thing clear to me. Legal issues aren't just for big companies. They are for everyone. And the day you start your business or open your doors. A huge thank you to Lisa Coppola and Matthew Pelkey for sharing such practical advice with us today. If you're a business owner, take a minute this week and think about those legal foundations and the team that you've built to help you with your risk mitigation. I'm Susan Steffen, and this has been the Incorporate podcast. Until next time, stay smart, stay protected, and keep building your business.